All right, so this chapter, actually, this series is about adolescence, and we're going to be looking at the biological aspects of adolescence, psychological aspects, sociological aspects, and cultural aspects, and really how they're interwoven. And we've talked about the other stages of development, and so this one is a progression of that one. And it is one of the ones that gets a lot of airtime when people think about lifespan, because so much happens in adolescence that really brings the societal, psychological, and biological into play. One of the things that we're going to be talking about is that, according to a number of different theories, there's this idea that this is when children become more identified as an adult to themselves and sometimes to society. And in that process, they are going through a lot of different changes about who they are and who they are separate from their family. A big caveat is that this is very culturally based. Not every culture has adolescence and or identifies it in the same way as the United States does.
And I just wanted to comment that because this is a time of tremendous development in all these different ways, this is also a place that we as social workers often interact with youth, with their families, with their communities, because there's so much going on. And whether we're helping young people, whether we're working within families, we're often called on to assist in this stage of development.
Yeah, and I think, putting this within the context of a kind of that micro, meso, macro perspective, right? Adolescence is really a time where young people are moving from that more enclosed, protected family environment, and they are really developing that peer group and those relationships with their peer groups and larger society. And so they're exploring all of that. And oftentimes, I think for social workers, we end up interacting with adolescents who maybe are taking more risks and, really kind of exploring or even testing, right, what those boundaries are for them.
So my own practice, a lot of times I get the adolescents because the parents are at their end, not quite sure what to do. And it really, you see it as a family systems issue, right? So the parents from pre-birth have been programmed to make sure that their child is safe and that their job is to mentor that child into a safe world. And then, it's easy to say, don't touch that outlet or don't run into the road. But then when they get into adolescence and that child is beginning to feel like, you know what, I'm a separate individual and maybe I don't need a curfew and maybe I don't need to be warned. And part of it is they just need to start testing the things that they've been taught. Well, do I believe that? Do I honestly believe that I'm gonna, get hurt if I do X, Y, or Z? And, who am I in relation to myself, my family, my friends? And for parents who's really kind of saw their job is to keep your kids safe, it's a really hard transition to make, to give them that freedom to fail.
Yeah. And I say, when you get your baby and you're a new parent and you have a kid in your arms, you have this whole scenario that plays out about who your child is going to become. Mm-hmm. And then your children kind of screw it up by deciding that they have their own ideas and their own life. And so part of, that struggle with with families and adolescents is helping parents to let go of their image of who their child is supposed to become and seeing, actually, how is that child wired? What's their emotional development? What's their temperament? And letting that child really explore themselves and become themselves, right? So I especially working with LGBTQ adolescents, I often saw that struggle with the families. This is not who I had. This was not my plan for my child.
Mm-hmm. And for me, the strengths perspective really helps here, because then as a parent, if I can think of it, well, part of my investment in my child's way of life is I want them to have a happy future. So maybe they're not going to go down the path I thought, but what are their strengths that I have witnessed all their lives that they're going to be able to use when they enter, during adolescence and then as they enter into their adulthood?
Yeah, what were you going to
It's
say, Becky?
taking, I was going to say, it's that period of independence similar to what toddlers go through, but with more power and more abilities. And so it goes from saying no to really having this ability to push back. And I really appreciate what you said, Nicole, about the strengths perspective, because I've also worked with a lot of families who, when there is a struggle, have the request or the approach, fix my child.
Mm-hmm.
And not so much in the beginning, help us be closer as a family, help us manage the risk, but really this child is broken.
Mm-hmm.
And fix that child. And so coming from that perspective, what's working, understanding maybe why some of the things are going on, understanding both from the adolescent perspective, developmentally, what is testing, and figuring out who they are and what they want to do, but also the role that they play in the family.
Mm-hmm.
And how maybe the homeostasis has been upset, and what are ways to balance the family with the teen in a different role.
Yeah, and I think that thinking about the biological development, through adolescence and just all of those changes that are coming, there's a need to both, I think, educate the adolescents about what's happening, how is your body changing, but also to remind families and parents of that process as well, right? Because what I say is oftentimes I see um, adults who still look at children or adolescents and think that they're just mini adults, that they think like us, they feel like us, and but we know the brain development is not complete, hormonal development is making significant changes, and part of I think the work of supporting adolescents is there's all of these new feelings, right? I'm being flooded with so many different feelings. What are they? How do I recognize them? How do I manage them? And so helping the adolescent to go through that process, but also helping their parents to remember that process.
I think it's really hard to realize how much our hormones have to do with how we experience things and how we process things, and how much of that is in turmoil and change in adolescence. I wonder what you guys are thinking about with the whole cell phone interconnectedness of society. So it's definitely a factor in how someone sees themselves, how they feel connected to others, uh, communication. This is the first time in human history that we've been able to connect almost constantly with another person who's not physically with us, and even somebody who's across the world. And so how does that developmentally affect us? And how is their development into adulthood going to look and feel and be? And how is that different from ours? Or is there any effect?
Yeah, well, definitely right there's those opportunities, I think, for a lot of connection for young people. Uh, you know, um, Young people can be more connected through technology. I think for queer adolescents, what technology has done, if you're in a small town and you're the only trans identified young person, Tumblr has been this phenomenal um, window that gives many adolescents really an education about, oh, I am not alone. And if you watch the identity development that's going on a platform like Tumblr around, what it means to be gray sexual, asexual, there's just so many new terminologies that are being developed. There's a real potential for positive, I think, um, growth in this, and then also that potential, right, for really isolation and loneliness, and all the things we see with sites like Facebook, where it just makes us feel bad, right? Because it's such a curated life, and helping young people to understand that's not reality. It's a curated view of life.
And thinking especially for teens about bullying,
Mm.
and where, I mean, that's something that's gone on over long periods of time. But now what that cell phone age does is it comes home with you, that there is no escape.
Mhm.
And it is private in a way that maybe at school it's a little more obvious. But these messages coming home are really dangerous. So I think, to Ben's point, it's opened up, and it's also, in opening things, there are risks as well as benefits.
Yeah, and I worry about the access to pornography too. There's just no filter at all. And so for adolescents, and sexuality, and education around sexuality, I really think we need new models of how we talk to adolescents. You can be 11 years old or 10 years old. If you get access to the internet, you're going to know a lot about sexuality, but it's not healthy sexuality. Right? It's pornography,
Which
and
can be objectifying and oppressive and very stereotypical.
right. And so I think for families, what I'm seeing is a lot of work about, one, how do we monitor what's going on online, which most parents don't know how to do, and then really having very frank conversations with their kids about sexuality.
There's this could be a phenomenon, and I'm curious what you guys think of it and if you've observed it. In Japan, they're actually naming it, and it is this phenomenon of mainly males, but not always, who are in late adolescence having a hard time, or they're isolating themselves, they're staying home, they're maybe not pursuing college, or even if they pursue college, they feel lost about what they're going to do next. And it seems as if there's a lack of a path, a societal path that maybe in our generations we had, where, you went to graduate from high school, and if you were lucky, you went on to college, and that got you a job. And so some theorize that it's about that the whole employment is different, and so it's harder for people to get into jobs, and that the college is now just as expected as high school, and therefore it just kind of creates this longer adolescence that doesn't have definition, and that it's doing something. It creates this kind of almost lost generation.
Yeah, well, and the way that just reminds me of, Nicole, is what are the stages and the stage-based theories that we have in our textbook, are they still as relevant? you know and and how are we going to adapt some of those theories, Erickson's theories, some of the other theories that we've been looking at and that students are supposed to be reading this week? Do they fit for a lot of our modern societies? What do you think? Because I think that was an example what you were sharing, with the Japanese young men, who they get called herbivores. It's a Japanese term for, that they don't eat meat. They're just kind of these. So in Japanese culture, there's definitely a lot that is being looked at around that. And, yeah.
I personally think all these theories about stages of development are very culturally based. And I think they should always be looked at from the time period in which they were developed. And that we get to choose, which of those we feel like, wow, that's actually a stable concept that's been going through over time. That's an interesting human phenomenon. But also to be open to the idea that maybe these are just constructs.
There's some conversation, and I don't know if you've heard any of it, but that I guess the subtitle is 30 is the new 20.
Mm-hmm.
And that really is that same idea that adolescence is kind of being stretched, and people are doing in their 30s what they had done in their 20s. And so what does that mean for you if you're 14 or 15?
Yeah, and interestingly, is also the why. Why is that happening? It speaks to how much societal influences determine and shape what we consider to be natural human development. So for the longest time, people believed that developmentally, adolescence ended at, well, legally it ended at like 18, and now you're done and you're an adult. And then people later realized that hormonally, you're probably not really done until around 25. So they were trying to tease out the biological versus whatever. And but with this, we're really seeing the cultural influence of this, whether it's about the workforce or whether it's just social media and what people's concept of growing up means.
Yeah.
And also families and building families. And that's at this point being delayed as well.
Yeah, and I think of, with that understanding that physiological development is going on till, age of 25. There I'm working with people who are really concerned about things like marijuana, the legalization of marijuana, and people at the ages of 18, 20, 21 really using THC at a time where we know that it actually can impair kind of that final brain development, and that it's really much better if people are going to do things like usage of marijuana to try to get them to wait till 25, not 18, 21. So, I think that understanding of physiological development and the time frame for it, we need to really look at that and do more education around that.
Interesting. It's also important to remember that once you turn 25, it's not like, you take it out of the oven and it's done, right? It's that somewhere along those years, you're going to fit into that, just like in early development. Just because the child hasn't walked yet doesn't mean, oh my God, what's going on? And what also strikes me about this is that it seems like our definition of human development is a lot about our role in society. So in other cultures, and also earlier in our own, when it was expected that you're going to get married very young and you're going to have kids very young, adolescence either didn't exist or was incredibly short, and you just went from childhood to adulthood. And here we're talking about that as well, sort of like, well, you don't have the need to hurry up and be financially stable in order to have kids because you're delaying having kids. So then what does that mean about what you're doing?
And what does it mean when one generation is followed by a totally different generation, when the generation that comes of age in the recession
Right.
Is living at home because that's really the only option financially. And so it's maybe driven just or primarily by economic forces.
Yeah, good point. And that, I think helping individuals to understand some of those constraints that they may be living within. And, especially in our society, we are so focused on that individual, you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that the idea that there are cohort effects, right, that based on the economic development of, whether you graduated in college in 2007 or 2012, actually can make a significant difference because of that, the Great Recession, on how much income you will make across your lifetime. And it's hard for people to understand that sociological piece of development as well, Jackie. So
and the longevity of that, how much it really does shape you for a generation.
Right.
And also, it's a very cultural thing to assume that children should grow up and then move separate from the rest of their family. For many cultures, it's like, why would you move out of the household of your family? It has nothing to do with my identity or my, my self-sufficiency. It's, I live with my family. That's what we do. We're multi-generational.
Right.
And it's also interesting when there are differences within families, and when when the parents maybe think that the children should remain at home, and there's a cultural divide in the family itself. And I think because we're working with so many people, we come from so many backgrounds, that we always are attending to those differences in our cross-cultural work, but also within families and within communities.
Yeah, agreed. We've got about maybe 5-6 minutes when we wanted to stop. Are there other topics you want to make sure that we kind of from the readings this week that we discuss?
You're going to hear a lot about suicide and adolescence, and it's really because of these forces that we're talking about. And when you talk about, we talk about marginalized groups and a higher risk of self-harm or suicide, it's really about, is there support for going through these changes from society and from their own community? There's nothing intrinsic about adolescence that makes you want to kill yourself. It's really about how incredibly complicated this time is and how much targeted support is important.
Yeah, and again, for LGBTQ plus adolescents, research has really shown family support or family rejection is a significant risk factor for self-harm. And adolescents who are in highly rejecting families are about 8 times, so that's like about 800% more likely to have a suicide attempt by the age of 25. They're also about 4 times more likely to end up HIV positive and about 2.5 times more likely to have a substance abuse disorder. And so, that process of, am I cared for?
Am I of value? It's kind of hard to take care of myself if others don't think I have value. Why would I care about safe sex? Why would I care about whether I'm going to get addicted?
Right, and it has lifelong consequences. So, so yeah, I think that, what's my role? Do I have a place where I feel like I fit? Are there people who are really creating that kind of support around me? And adolescents who have that, right, are going to be much more likely to do well and thrive. And adolescents who don't have as much of that are definitely going to be more at risk and have more challenges.
Important things for us to notice when we're working with people and families.
And this can be something really scary when you're a new practitioner and you're working with anyone, but especially with teens, and you get a sense that there's a risk there. Sometimes it's very clear when teens or adults are feeling, or children are suicidal, and sometimes it's not. There's some gray that I'd like to sleep forever, or maybe I wouldn't want to wake up, and this is someplace where our colleagues are important, our consultation. I was supervising an intern, and the first client she saw, it came up on the first day. And that we're in our profession not alone, and not having, these are such crucial decisions that we don't have to make them alone. And this is where, even if you're not sure, having a conversation, asking for help, and then figuring out the next steps. But this is where there's a lot of things where you can go back and fix it if somebody tries to give you a gift and you're not sure how to respond. But this kind of high risk, you want to respond right away.
Yeah. We're just in a couple of minutes. Any thoughts about, one of the challenges of early practice? How do I get a connection with an adolescent?
Oy. That can be tough.
Any advice or thoughts about that? Because, you know, just finding a way to connect is such a, you know, getting in that room, it's such a,
Part of the problem, and this is true with child therapy too, is the sitting face to face talking about your internal journey is not necessarily something that developmentally is ripe, especially if it's an adult and you already feel like, well, you're not going to understand my world, so why am I here? Especially if they're sitting in front of you because their parents say that there's something wrong with them and they've got to go see you.
right?
Yes. The response to why are you here is they made me come. So often doing something, whether it's someone is interested in art and you can do art and conversation comes out of that, or some other kinds of activities, and you use that to build the relationship. There are a few into talk therapy, but I would agree with Nicole, not so many. And so finding another way, and talking about things that are meaningful to them. And it may not start with things are difficult. It may be finding out more about them. And you know, we had one in a program and they were really interested in fashion. And so getting them to talk about their interests really sparked and built that relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Any other? We've got 2 minutes. Other thoughts?
I would say one thing in kind of summary just about my experience was that both adolescents can really be a challenge in that they're going through a lot of growth, they're experiencing a lot of growth, a lot of hormones, but that also there's often, not always, but this hopefulness and interest in the future and in that growth.
Mm-hmm.
And so that that's the other side of the challenge, is really that strength that makes them so interesting to work with, and also can be very insightful in their own behavior and their own experiences.
Great. Okay.